Well, I don't know about the leaking bit. Depends on who you talk to. I'm simply saying that based upon my sources in the Department of Defense, people who are close to the senior military leadership tell me that they have made it very clear that choosing to fight Russia in Ukraine would be a serious mistake and should be avoided. That's what they've said. And I think they're being honest about that. And I think they're being truthful for a change. The second part is, are we capable of fighting? Well, of course, we're capable of fighting. The real question is, if you're going to fight, will you win? And this is the question that people don't ask enough. This goes back to an old strategic axiom. Measure what you might gain by what you might lose. A collision with Russia would be a loss for us. There's nothing to be gained by it. The Russians have nothing that we need or want. There's no ideological hostility. We're not competing for power or control over any particular region. Russia's dispute is exclusively with Ukraine. We're a large part of the reason why the dispute exists. There's no question about that. But we can end that tomorrow morning if we decide to by simply saying, we fought long enough. Russia has the upper hand. Zelensky, sit down, shut up, and take notes. We must have a ceasefire, but first we have to agree to negotiations without preconditions.
Does Washington want to fight Russia via a proxy war?
I think they did. I think they regret it at this point, to be blunt with you. No one will admit it publicly, but if you go back to the donor conference where Lloyd Austin spoke to the gathered donors from NATO and other nations and said, we have a very short time left, a very short window of time in which to make things happen. And time is running out. I mean, I quoted him in the op-ed piece for that reason. He knows, everyone in Washington in a position of authority now knows Ukraine is losing. Ukrainian resistance is crumbling. The state itself is in danger of going out of existence. That's how bad it is. So the theory is, well, if we can give them anything within the next 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 days, perhaps we can rescue them from disaster. I don't see much evidence for that, but I think that's the theory.
Can Ukraine survive as a country if Putin pursues this war all out, whether for military reasons or for domestic Russian political reasons?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind, and this is something of which I was not aware until I consulted with a friend who's done some excellent demographic analysis. And he points out that at the beginning of this war, there were, at least in theory, 37.5 million Ukrainians in Ukraine. And he makes the point that today that's not the case. There were already 2 million Ukrainians working in either Great Britain or the European Union outside of the country. You now have 4 million Ukrainian citizens, albeit Russians, people who speak Russian, living under Russian occupation or administration right now in the provinces in the south. Then you have over 10 million Ukrainians that have fled the country.
10 million?
10 million.
That's a third of the country or a quarter of the country.
Yeah, you've got 1 million that have gone into Russia and the rest that have headed west. Now, to this must be added the losses. And again, no one is telling us the truth in the West about the horrific losses that Ukraine has taken. You've heard me say about 157,000 dead on the battlefield. That includes 35,000 missing in action, presumed dead. And I've talked about a total of almost 400,000 casualties, people that are wounded. In most cases, not all, but in most cases, more than half of those will never return to duty because the wounds are too horrific. In other words, they're permanently lost to the Ukrainian fight. Now, supposedly when Zelensky was in town speaking to Secretary Austin and General Milley, several people have insisted that he actually told them that 257,000 Ukrainians have died. That includes soldiers, in other words, those in uniform, civilians, all types, all kinds, 257,000. Well, we don't know. I mean, that's an unconfirmed rumor. But what it does tell you is that today in Ukraine, there are roughly between 18 and 22 million people left in the country under Zelensky's control. Now, Judge, that number is roughly the same as the number of people living in the Netherlands. You cannot sustain this war with that small population. Judge, I'm not hearing you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Gotcha.
Okay. Apologies.
That's okay.
For watching and listening. Sometimes I'm all thumbs. I want to play a clip from Jack Devine. This is a guy that our audience loves to hate. He is, however, career CIA, and for many years was in charge of American espionage in Russia and monitoring Russian espionage here. Here's Jack Devine betting on a Ukraine win.
I'm betting on the Ukrainians still. It's not to say that the Russians aren't going to be formidable. I do think there will be undertrained. There'll be sometimes when you create something big and it's not well trained, they become cannon fodder. So I think it's going to be a really tough spring, and I think the war in many ways will be decided. There won't be a victor. In other words, the Russians cannot conquer Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are not going to beat the Russians. There's a certain point where both sides pull back. Even if you don't have an agreement, they lower their intensity. And that's when I think Putin personally is in trouble in his own country, and I think he goes. That's why the stakes are so big.
So he's suggesting that this will be over when both sides lower their intensity, and if Putin does that, quote, he goes, because that will not be interpreted as a victory for the Russian nationalists. Your comments on that, Colonel?
Well, remember, the CIA has been telling us lies almost from the very beginning about everything happening in Russia.
Well, when Mike Pompeo was running the CIA, he publicly acknowledged that's their job, to lie to us. So how do you know whether to believe them or not?
Well, they do a very good job of lying. The problem is they're lying to Americans, and this man, Devine, knows absolutely nothing about Russians. I don't care what his job was, or about Ukrainians or the Slavic peoples that occupy Eastern Europe. The Russians are winning. Ukraine is crumbling. Ukraine's on the verge of collapse. We're going to watch that happen over the next several weeks. The Russians will crush out of existence what remains of the Ukrainian armed forces, and I think they'll have to go after this regime, assuming Zelensky and his friends don't rapidly flee the country to Poland or somewhere else. Now, having said that, the Russians are being very methodical, very deliberate. They are moving constantly, but they are not moving on multiple axes simultaneously. In other words, you're not going to see the blitzkrieg. What you're going to see on several axes are what I would call large meat grinders that are just systematically plowing forward, annihilating everything that they come in touch with that is Ukrainian until the Ukrainians are finished. There is no incentive for them at this point to negotiate with us unless we go in without conditions. Would the Russians prefer not to annihilate everything in Ukraine? Yes. They never went in there with that goal to begin with. But you can't walk in there and say, well, the only way we'll talk to you is if you withdraw all your forces from Ukraine and Crimea. That's absurd.
So really what you're saying is there's no way that Ukraine, and I'm paraphrasing you from the column, which I mentioned earlier, there's no way Ukraine can survive this war as an intact country.
Listen, I just told you what the demographics say. And what's even worse is that Ukraine has the lowest birth rate in Europe.
Oh.
So in addition to having lost millions of people because frankly, people like Devine and his masters have decided to wage this war on the backs of Ukraine. Ukraine is destroyed. I don't know what survives of it. I have no idea what will happen.
Even though I am your friend and admirer, and at times your student, let me raise your blood pressure one more time with Jack Devine on a weakened Russia.
Do we want a strong Russia with Putin and Xi? Is that going to bring us peace and harmony so we can live in isolation? I think Putin, the day he crossed, I'm on record in the Washington Post, in March last year, a few days after he invaded, he sowed the seed of his own demise. That is actually good news for us. Whoever causes it, that's a good news. A weak Russia that sees Putin going weakens China as well as Russia.
Does that make sense to you?
Again, I think the man's delusional. Putin has never been stronger than he is today. The Russian people have never been more united than they are today. Only someone who's never spent any time in the country and doesn't know anybody over there would make such preposterous statements. This is part of the larger false narrative. Look, he reminds me of some of the Germans that stood around in Berlin in 1945 and asked, what about the inevitable victory? What's wrong? What's happened? Because the regime over the previous 6 to 12 months had lied so consistently and effectively that the Germans were surprised to see Russian and American troops on the outskirts of the city. I think all I can tell you is that no, he's dead wrong. Now let's talk about this weakened Russia business. It's not weakened. The IMF has now stepped forward and talked about growth in Russia dramatically improving. Their exports are way up. None of this nonsense that we anticipated that was bad has happened to Russia. Russia's in a very strong and healthy position. We, on the other hand, our growth is declining, and it's not going to get better in the near term. Secondly, Russia is a state with an important role in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. If Russia were to be destroyed, which is not going to happen, if it were to weaken, it would open up opportunities for all sorts of potentially malicious actors to intervene. First of all, Eastern Siberia is not of much interest to the Chinese, contrary to popular belief, but it's very interesting to Japan and Korea. And the Japanese and the Koreans view Eastern Siberia as their territory because up until about 300 years ago, Mongols, Turkic peoples, Tartars, they were the only people in the region, and they're brothers of the Manchus, Mongols, and Japanese and Koreans. So do you really want Russia to collapse in Eastern Siberia? I don't think so. You go into Central Asia, Russia is a stabilizing factor there. In fact, Xi depends upon Russia to help stabilize it because the people in Central Asia have much more confidence and trust in the Russians than they do in the Chinese.
How unified is NATO behind Washington? I'm going to play a clip. Yeah, right. I'm going to play a clip for you in a minute from the president of Croatia. It's not Germany. It's not France. It's Croatia. But the language is very strident, and the criticisms of the West are very strong and articulate. Take a listen.
Ali ja nisam predsjednik Ukrajine.
Ako se Ukrajina želi braniti, treba li joj pomoći?
Razdragani pacifisti u cvjetnim haljenicama odjednom bi se napili krvi nekome, ali ne oni, nego preko tuđeg grbača. Ovo je u određenoj mjeri duboko nemoralno što radimo kao kolektivni zapad koji u biti ne postoji, jer tu nema rješenja. Rješenje nije promjena vlasti u Rusiji. Dapače, njemački tenkovi u Harkovu će dodatno homogenizirati Ruse. Politički će ih homogenizirati. Zbližit će ih sa Kinezima. To se događa.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. The West is not united. You've been saying that. The tanks coming from Germany, he didn't mention the American tanks. The tanks coming from Germany will only gin up the Russians to fight more aggressively. It's in nobody's interest to weaken Russia. And he's a member of NATO.
Of course. Two things. Nassim Taleb often talks about finance, and he talks about people at the top who don't have skin in the game. Our problem in Washington, D.C., and in many capitals in Europe right now is that they're perfectly happy to fight this war until Ukraine ceases to exist, and 1 million Ukrainians are dead because they have no skin in the game. They haven't put themselves at risk, nor will they do so. And that's disgraceful, and he's talking about that to some extent. And then secondly, it's interesting this man is a Croat because, the Croatians, like most Europeans, to be perfectly blunt, that people don't like to admit, were part of the crusade to destroy Bolshevism during World War II. But he knows that Russia is not a communist state. He knows Russia does not aspire to conquer Europe. The Russians learned the hard way that imperialism is a very bad form of government and business. When you move into countries that are not yours and you have to govern and sustain people that are not yours, inevitably there's bad blood, there's anger, there's corruption. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who probably more than anyone else inspires the Russians who are at the top today, made it very clear we should all be grateful that this horrible empire that existed is gone. We don't want to govern other people. We want to govern ourselves. We want our own country, this place called Russia. And that is the way the Russians think right now. They're not interested in conquering anything, but we are making it impossible for them to turn away because we make threat after threat after threat to dismember the country, to destroy its regime. And we keep talking about it as though this is something the Russians want. They do not want that.
After decades of German political leaders disarming Germany and depriving Berlin of its credibility. I'm quoting your article. Chancellor Scholz decides to send tanks. Is this to please Joe Biden? Because he's not going to please anybody his domestic political forces, is he?
He'll please some people in Germany, a minority, I would suspect. The majority, I think, are somewhat horrified because the Germans, based on their experience, and they also know their own history, know that when Berlin and Moscow have cooperated and done business together, there has been peace in Europe. You know, if there's any one war in human history that made absolutely no sense, it was the war between Tsarist Russia and Imperial Germany. They had been close allies and friends for hundreds of years. There was no reason for that to happen. It did. The Second World War, we know the background on that. It was a huge tragedy. Everyone decided in 1945, who was German, this will not happen again. We will not permit it. I cannot imagine Chancellor Kohl or Chancellor Schmidt, Helmut Schmidt, that some of your viewers may remember, standing up and urging equipment be sent to this corrupt gangster regime in Kiev that's killing off its own people with these stupid instructions that are given to their generals in the field with a military structure that is corrupt and celebrating it. On the contrary, I think they would have said absolutely not, out of the question. This man, Scholz, is not going to last long. And if anything, what we're seeing now, even though it is not patently obvious, is the beginning of the end of NATO.
So, Colonel, big picture, here's my head scratcher. If the West, if the leading countries economically in NATO, the United States, Germany, Great Britain, France, want to wage this war against Russia, if Tony Blinken and his globalist buddies in the foreign ministries in Western Europe really think that they can use the war to push Putin out or weaken him, if Jack Devine and the CIA, or if Jack is actually articulating what the CIA is trying to accomplish, why is the Western military response so tepid? I mean, you can't fight the Russians with just a half dozen tanks, and you can't fight them at all with tanks that aren't going to get there for another 4 or 5 or 6 months. And American troops in Poland are not going to keep Putin up at night.
We have 100,000 troops in Europe. And of that number, I'd be surprised if we have 40 or 50,000 combat troops. That means the soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains who actually go in and shoot people. In other words, most of that is still support. And we don't have that much artillery. We don't have that much in the way of immediate indirect fire support. We're in no position to do it. We could bring in more Poles. They can bring in a couple of 100,000 Poles to fight, but they're not going to be adequately armed to take on the Russians, and they're not going to be adequately trained. So it's sheer lunacy. But again, you've got to go back and understand how this began. At the beginning, Putin sent in a very small force and gave them very specific instructions that they were not to kill civilians, they were not to damage infrastructure, because he was simply trying to demonstrate the seriousness with which Russia viewed what we were doing in eastern Ukraine by building up this dangerous force against them. Well, it took 2-3 months. He finally figured out no one is going to negotiate with us. No one cares to. In the meantime, we reached the erroneous conclusion that, see, look, the Russians are weak. The Russians can't cope. The Russians are no threat. We can beat them. Well, that was the wrong conclusion. And what we're seeing happen right now is a massive expansion of Russian military power on a scale that we have not seen since the Cold War. And this is going to be a permanent expansion, a large and powerful force. The 700,000 plus that are around Ukraine right now are a brand new force, a brand new army. This thing is poised to do one thing: annihilate whatever is in its path. It will do that. However, again, the Russians are being methodical. They're being cautious because they do worry that we are led by impulsive, erratic personalities in Washington. And that stupidly, when we realize that the place is falling apart, I mean Ukraine, someone will say, well, we have to do something. I don't know how many times while I was on active duty, I heard people at the top of the political structure say, well, we have to do something. As soon as they say that,
right,
leave the room.
Right.
Get the hell out of there.
I mean, this is a favorite government line. They have to give the impression to the public that they're doing something, even if it's 180 degrees from what they're doing. But the West, whether it's Chancellor Scholz or President Biden, or to a lesser extent, the new Prime Minister of Great Britain, is like a boxer punching with his left hand and then apologizing to the gallery with his right for hitting too hard. What are they accomplishing?
Scholz is doing what he's done throughout his career. Remember that Scholz and others have grown up over the last 30 or 40 years in this environment where there was very little change. And their formative period of experience came after the Cold War ended. And they saw a very different world. And they became, I think, enamored of this notion that the United States is the hegemon of the world, and that whatever we do is right, and anybody who resists us is morally wrong. They've taken this position, and this justifies all sorts of dangerous behavior. I don't think that Mr. Scholz is going to last much longer. I certainly don't think his foreign minister will. These people are out of touch with reality. No competent German statesman over the last 300 or 400 years would have made the stupid remarks and statements that they have.
Didn't he just lose his defense minister about 2 weeks ago?
Well, we haven't had much of it in the way of defense ministers in that country now for at least 20 years. I mean, when we went to Desert Storm in 1991, arguably the Germans had the finest forces in NATO. I mean, they were top notch, and they remained excellent through the mid 1990s. And then a series of leftist governments systematically dismantled them. This is after Chancellor Kohl left. Now, on the one hand, they took the position that Russia was not a threat, and it is not a military threat to them unless they make it so. And that was understandable, but they lost sight of the fact that if you have no skin in the game, as I said earlier, when it comes to military power, nobody's going to pay attention to you. I mean, the Polish army could invade Germany tomorrow morning and conquer it in a week.
Ooh, well, that's the line of this this interview. Colonel, always a pleasure, sir. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you. By the way, can I add one thing that a lot of our people don't seem to understand about these tanks?
Please.
We promised 31 M1 series tanks. They have to be built from scratch. And people have said, well, why is that? Well, it's very simple. We have a form of, it certainly is reminiscent of the Cold War. During the Cold War, we frequently would pick up someone that we were convinced was a Soviet agent. Most of the time they were, but not always. And essentially use them as trading material so that someone that the Soviets had picked up could be freed in some sort of exchange. I don't know if that's the case this time around, but perhaps it is. But the thing to keep in mind is that this Wall Street Journal is very anti-Russian and extremely neoconservative in its outlook. It certainly doesn't bear any resemblance to the Wall Street Journal I grew up with. And as a result, they're not very sympathetic to the Wall Street Journal and its owners. And of course, the owner is Rupert Murdoch. And I don't know that anyone has said anything about it other than I think Tucker mentioned it on his program that this man had been apprehended. Now, he was a long, long way from Moscow. And I have no idea what he was doing. He was within striking distance of some Russian military installation. And theoretically, he was trying to write a story on what the impact was on Russia of the war and whether or not its industries were actually producing and so forth. Whatever was the case, he was picked up. And I don't think the Russians are going to be very sympathetic.
Do the Russians respect journalistic rights? Does he have some sort of immunity because he's a bona fide journalist for a bona fide American media outlet, albeit one that is anti-Russian?
Well, you can be a bona fide Russian journalist with all the right credentials. And if you are seen photographing or visiting Virginia, say in the vicinity of Norfolk, and we are in a state of war, I think we would pick the man up. See, the thing that has to be borne in mind is the Russians are at war. And under those circumstances, it's very foolish to go near any military installation. And that's why I say if we were at war and we saw people nosing around submarine pens up in Puget Sound or a large Air Force base in Florida, we would pick them up right away.
So Jack Devine, and we'll run a clip from him a little later on, says that the Central Intelligence Agency does not use American journalists to do its dirty work, only foreign journalists. Is it inconceivable that Mr. Hershkowitz was working for American intelligence?
I simply don't know. What I do know is that he would probably willingly turn over any information he found to the CIA because he's very hostile to Russia, just as the CIA is doing everything in its power to keep this operation going in any way, shape, or form it can. It's trying to shape domestic opinion. We know that. It creates the narratives that are widespread inside the United States on everything right now connected to Russia. So does he work for them? In theory, no. Does that make any difference under the circumstances? Again, Russia is at war. This is an American journalist. He is somewhere close to or en route to a Russian military installation. He's going to get picked up.
Got it. What is the status of all of the tanks that everybody was all agog about a month or so ago? The German Leopards and the American Abrams. Have they arrived? Are they on their way there? What is the likelihood that they will tip the scales ever so slightly in favor of the Ukrainians?
Well, as far as I know, the numbers of American M1 series tanks have not arrived. I don't know when they're going to show up, but they're certainly in the process of being readied for, use by the Ukrainians. The Leopards have shown up, as have some of the other pieces of equipment, and of course the Bradleys. They're not really tanks. That's an armored fighting vehicle, but it does have a 25 millimeter chain gun on it that's very lethal. I don't know if they also are going to equip them with TOW missiles. That's also a lethal missile under the right circumstances. I think what people are discovering is that the Russians have a number of missiles. One of them is called the Coronet. And this Coronet missile can be fired from 5,000 meters away or potentially even further. It's self-guiding. Once you sight the target, you can essentially fire and forget it. And if that warhead reaches a tank, any tank, it will destroy the tank. It doesn't make any difference what it is. So that that is something that I guess people are now beginning to notice, because the Coronet missiles were used against Leopard tanks in Syria. And people should be very concerned about that. Again, this is something I think other analysts have said. It's not an individual weapon system. It's not the arrival of 200 tanks or 500 tanks that are going to make any difference. It's the integration of various types of equipment, tanks, armored fighting vehicles, various missile carriers, air defense, air and missile defense. For instance, there's a 30 millimeter automatic cannon linked to radar that's excellent, that's produced by Rheinmetall. I would say you'd probably need a couple of hundred of them on the battlefield just to protect yourself from all the various unmanned aerial systems. So the bottom line is, no, this isn't going to change anything.
Do the tanks have some sort of a weaponry or equipment in their skin, for lack of a better word, a lay phrase, to neutralize the weaponry that attacks them?
Well, they have what you would call active versus passive defense. An active defense system can be all sorts of things. It can be small explosives embedded in ceramic and metal tile that is applied on the outside of the tank's armor. There are different kinds of this thing. You actually can put radar on the tank itself that detects an incoming missile. All of this stuff exists. The problem is twofold. First of all, most of that active equipment only works once. In other words, once you've struck the tank once, you don't have that protection anymore. In other words, you get a direct hit.
Right.
If you strike it twice, you may get something more, but then you're essentially naked. It only gets you through a couple of initial fights. Okay. Secondly, we don't have anything right now to deal with what I would call top attack. In other words, a missile that comes in and strikes on top of the turret. This has been a threat for a long time. In other words, it comes in and it dives down on the top of the turret where the armor is thin. The Israelis are looking at a number of very innovative ways to change that can be integrated into future armored fighting vehicles.
Do the Russians have missiles that will do that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. By the way, so do the Germans. And they have not released any of those. We've been working on those, and I think we have some, if they're not already fielded in the U.S. military, and they may or may not be, I don't know. They certainly are in development. These are the new threats that are changing the nature of warfare. This is what effectively robs you of your mobility on the battlefield. And it robs you of your ability to use all of this armor that historically we've relied on to come to terms with the enemy, to go right in and kill the enemy at close range. It's not going to be solved quickly. It's sort of like World War I, when suddenly people discovered machine guns, artillery, and mines, and barbed wire and trenches, and the maneuver stopped. We're in a similar conundrum. It won't last forever, and we're going to have to find a way through it. But the bottom line is we're not really prepared for it.
The head of the Wagner Group has proclaimed that Bakhmut has fallen. President Zelensky has not refuted that. It seems to me, as a layperson in the military world, 10,000 miles away, that it's safe to say that Bakhmut has fallen. Do you have any intel on this?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, Prigozhin made a number of interesting remarks.
That's the head of the Wagner Group.
Of the Wagner Group, right. And Prigozhin said something that many of us have suspected was the case for months, but now we've had it from the horse's mouth, and I think it's probably true. And that is that Surovikin, the general that was brought in the early fall, late summer last year to change the command structure and the way the Russians were operating,
right,
decided to turn Bakhmut into what it became, a bloodbath, a meat grinder. So they were deliberately leaving Bakhmut partially surrounded, and in the hopes that more and more and more Ukrainian forces would be poured into it that could be systematically destroyed. That's the way it looked to me for a long time.
And is that the way it worked out?
Yes, absolutely. It's been brilliant for the Russians. This is the best thing that could have possibly happened to them. And one of the things that people don't understand is, well, why didn't they just cut this off and be done with it? Why aren't they doing that? Well, there's a reason. Because if your enemy comes to you, and I just described the battlefield that we're on now, which is not very favorable or friendly to large maneuver forces. So you have to infiltrate into this World War I setting. If that's what you're operating on, you're just doing what your enemy wants you to do. And I think Surovikin was the man behind that. And that's effectively what Prigozhin said. Now, they say that all but a few blocks, something like 11% of the sort of built up area of Bakhmut is absolutely devoid of Ukrainians, but there's still some left on the edge. And you still have talk, as we talked about the last time when we put the map up, you still have talks of 80,000 troops breaking through in or around or near Bakhmut in some fashion. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but there's still a lot of talk about that. So perhaps you leave the door open one more month and let more people, essentially convert themselves into corpses by going in there.
We just interviewed Jack Devine just about a half an hour ago, and he had some comments about the Russians and Bakhmut that either will affect your blood pressure or cause you to have some fun with them. Here's what he said.
In the last 2 months, you were telling me these great wizards of the war were saying the Russians have the 300,000 man army and they're going to roll right over Ukraine. Here we are, 150,000 troops went in, and they may or may not have taken a town. I mean, he is having a hard time. This is not victory. Anybody that thinks he's won something, God bless you. But I mean, I don't know how I could hold my head and invade a country and move a few kilometers, So I think he's in trouble. I think he's in serious trouble. That's why there's a fight between the regular military and the Wagner Group.
He, of course, to whom he refers is President Putin.
Well, Judge, what do you want me to say? I think Jack is entertaining to listen to, but I think he's got a severe problem with cranial rectal defilade. So thanks, Jack, for your interest in national defense. The other thing I would say is, and this is something else that people aren't paying attention to, but they should right now, the bridges over the Dnieper up at Zaporizhia and further north. These are major bridges that you can drive, 18-wheelers, tanks, anything you want across these bridges over that river. They're all intact.
Mm.
And the Russian citizenry has asked several times, why don't you destroy these and stop those Ukrainians from crossing that river? Well, the Ukrainians aren't crossing the river in very great strength anymore because they've killed most of them. They're trying to put together this big counterattack. We'll see what comes of it. I have serious doubts that it's going to amount to much. I think it's just going to get a lot of people killed. So why haven't they destroyed those bridges, Judge? Is it Jack Devine's perception that, well, the Russians just aren't very bright? They haven't done their battlefield assessment. They're not acting. Well, I don't agree with that. I think the Russians plan to use those bridges
themselves. I mean, what prompted the ridiculous comments from Jack was my inquiry about Bakhmut falling. And first he denied it, and then he said he had heard the rumors that it fell, and then he said it's just one little town. Well, you and I and the thousands that watch us when you're on this show looked at the map and saw how central and how critical that town is. And now you've told us that the Russian strategy has not only been to secure the town, but to use it as the jaws of death, if I may, for the Ukrainian troops that were foolish enough to be flooded into those jaws.
Well, Ukrainian commanders, we know, have begged Zelensky to let them get out. They described it exactly as it is, a meat grinder. They were just losing people. We've been through these discussions. The average lifespan for someone new to the front is, 4 hours? This is insane. So I think the Ukrainians knew that. The larger issue, and Jack is basically giving you the standard narrative, and that's fine.
Right.
And everybody's doing that in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. Every once in a while, a little bit of truth creeps in. But the bottom line is that no one is moving a lot anywhere until the mud goes away. And, you try to explain to Americans that this stuff is like slogging your way through 10 feet of slime that sticks everything, that stops everything. Americans can't even begin to imagine it. The only place I've seen in the United States we come close to it is in southern Texas, where you have something they call caliche. It's a real thick earth that becomes mud and does something similar. But even it pales before what we're dealing with in.
Is this unique to Ukraine? And is this possibly what makes the Ukraine earth, dirt, so fertile for growing wheat?
No, I think so. I think when you're talking about 10 to 15 meters deep in most places, this black earth, it's very rich, that will grow anything. Right. Throw anything in it, it grows.
When the Ukrainian military superiors are foolish enough to send their troops into a meat grinder or the jaws of death, does American intel know about this, even military intel? Are they warned about it? Or do the Ukrainians do it anyway because of this vain effort to die fighting?
Well, now you're moving into an area where we just don't know. I mean, I'm sure some of your former intelligence officers that you've spoken to can give you a better picture. My experience is that, first of all, if you've already decided what the outcome is going to be, which is the case in Washington, that Russia is going to be defeated, humiliated, and driven east out of Ukraine forever and ultimately capitulate and give up Crimea, if you believe that, then a whole lot of things don't work well. And one of those is that you may just ignore what comes up to you that doesn't conform to your preconceived ideas. That's always been a problem. We went through that in Vietnam for years.
This morning in Moscow, President Putin addressed publicly the new U.S. ambassador to Moscow. There were other Western ambassadors there as well. And he basically blamed the war on the United States and articulated in public his view, a view you and I share, and most people watching us now share, I think, that the U.S. was responsible for the coup in Ukraine in 2014, the so-called Color Revolution. And the U.S. started all of this and thus is largely responsible for it. I don't know that President Putin has been that direct, that public about this before.
Well, I think he certainly made the larger case. He hasn't been specific about the so-called coup, but there's a huge mountain of evidence to support what he's saying. And by the way, you now have Mr. Netanyahu in Israel, who is absolutely convinced that we're running a quote unquote color revolution against him and his government.
Well, you're a question ahead of me as to whether, God bless you, Colonel, whether you believe that the Central Intelligence Agency was responsible for massive, persistent, endless demonstrations in the streets in Jerusalem and Israel over the makeup of the Israeli judiciary.
Well, you have this thing called the National Endowment for Democracy that is all over the place. And the National Endowment for Democracy should probably be renamed Color Revolution Headquarters for the subversion and installation of new governments that are subservient to, responsive to U.S. will. I mean, that was clearly going on in Kazakhstan in the first few weeks of this Ukrainian disaster. You'll recall the Russians sent a lot of special forces in there to help the government recover itself. It's been the case in any number of places. I think that's one of the reasons that Lukashenko has effectively signed on 100% for Putin, because you had the same outfit working in Minsk.
Right.
This is not new. Now, is the CIA involved with that? Of course.
Right. How else could it have happened? Well, President Putin was speaking directly into the eyes of the American ambassador in Moscow. President Zelensky was visiting one of his staunchest allies in Poland. We have a little clip there. There's the president of Poland, and there's President Zelensky. What more can the Poles give him short of troops on the ground, which we know is what he wants?
Well, now we've got another problem in the region. All of these, well, I shouldn't say all, but most of the states in Central East Europe that border Russia or are close to it in any way have agendas. We've got to remember that Poland, after World War I, regained much of its territory that it had lost in the 1790s. It would like to do the same thing again. Remember that Stalin's great gift to the Europeans was to shove millions of Germans further west, then shove millions of Poles into places that were historically German, at least for 1,000 years. And this had a wonderful effect because it forced the Germans away from Russia, but it also created in Stalin's mind permanent conditions of hostility between the Germans and the Poles for the territorial changes that he imposed on them.
Right.
Hungary lost vast territory at the end of the Second World War. The Kingdom of Hungary was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Right.
They controlled vast lands that are now occupied by the Romanians. Some are occupied by the Serbs. Some are occupied today by Croats. Some are occupied by Slovaks. So you go back into these countries and you begin to talk to people, and just because you lost a war, just because you weren't on the winning side 100 years ago, you have to understand these people. They were dominant powers for centuries, dominant not just in economic or military terms, but also culturally, linguistically. You get the same thing when you go to Iran. You know, very few people understand that from the Chinese border all the way to the border with Russia and Ukraine, the language that was spoken on the so-called Silk Road was Persian.
All right. Well, while we're talking about cultural, are there cultural rumblings now in Kosovo?
Yes. Yeah, that's another terrible wound. It's another example of where we intervened. We created an artificial construct that was forced into existence that otherwise would never have been tolerated in the region. Remember,
Yugoslavia?
Yeah. Well, remember that Yugoslavia fell apart. That too was inevitable because the majority of people that were Roman Catholics or Muslim certainly did not want to live under Orthodox Christian Serbs. that's another gift from World War I. It was a dumb idea. We're going to force people that have been either allied or ruled by Catholic Germans for 1,000 years into the arms of Christian Orthodox Serbs. It's crazy, but we did it. So that fell apart. And then we decided, well, all of these people must be compelled to live together in the new multicultural, multinational, multi, whatever it is, paradise that we in Washington are creating. And the whole world will learn this is the way it must be. Well, this is all nonsense. Kosovo is part of Serbia and has been part of Serbia for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They lost it a couple of times and they regained it. And they fought very hard during the Balkan Wars to get it away from the Ottoman Turks. If you're Greek, if you're a Bulgarian, if you're Romanian, if you are Serbian, the presence of large Muslim populations that were essentially created by the Turks and separate governments and institutions that were installed by the Turks, they're very uncomfortable with this. And given what we experienced in 2001, you can imagine the paranoia flag went to full mast. It's still there. So Islamist terrorism, Islamist assassination programs, gangsterism, call it what you will, is run out of Kosovo to a large extent. It's a clearinghouse. A lot of those missing weapons from Ukraine show up in Kosovo and end up going to North Africa, down into the Arabian Peninsula, somewhere
Didn't
else.
we bomb the daylights out of Kosovo in the Clinton administration?
Well, we bombed it.
Mrs. Albright wanted sort of an American-controlled caliphate.
Yeah, well, that's largely it. You've got to go back to Albright and Al Gore, Sandy Berger, Strobe Talbot. These are all figures in the church of moralizing globalism, and they wanted to create this new paradise. And so we bombed them for 78 days. And of course, this had a hugely negative impact on all the Orthodox Christians that live in the region, because from their standpoint, we're backing an Islamist element in their neighborhood that they personally revile and detest. And we're doing it at the expense of Orthodox Christians. I mean, in that part of the world, you cannot be everyone's friend. If you side with anybody, you become instantly enemies for everybody else.
Of course.
And then we created this mess, and this mess is gradually beginning to unravel.
At the same time,